This is the Analog Gamers Podcast with your hosts.
I'm Shane.
And I'm Brent.
I'm Frank.
So our topic for today is going to be war games. We, in previous episodes, talked about cooperative games, and then we moved on to role-playing games, which kind of lie in between in that role-playing games have a heavy cooperative element to them, but they are also about fighting. So now we're going to take on fighting as a topic by itself, war games. So probably the most common war game known to our listeners and to the general public is Risk. Risk is a game where you're trying to conquer the world and you're moving what some people refer to as dudes on a map around to try and conquer various areas through a combat mechanism. War games run the scale from that kind of conquer the world that Risk has all the way down to the squad level. In fact, there's a hugely popular war game called Squad Leader, where the pieces represent individual men in a squad.
Yeah, for me, I played a lot of Risk growing up with my brother Zach. And, he always won, so I think he cheated. But one thing that I remember a lot about Risk, and I think is a common kind of criticism of that type of game, is it really ended up of like, who could get the biggest army on one space? And then it was just kind of the big army defeat a lot of territory, and then somebody else got a big army and defeat a lot of territory. And it's just kind of like the wave going across the map. And just kind of ended up like whoever could amass the biggest army in one turn would end up winning the game. And somehow that was him. I think he cheated. But yeah, so for me, for that game, it just kind of devolved into, everybody takes a turn where they get a big army and conquer a bunch of territory. And so it's kind of fun in the beginning of it because you're strategizing and figuring out what continents do I want to go to and where do I want to place all my armies. But I think eventually that game gets to a point when you're playing the classic version that it's just kind of a war of attrition, not just on the board, but like who can pay attention long enough to actually win the game.
So I had never played Classic Risk, and I still haven't, but last time we got together, I said that to these two, and they both said, okay, well then we're going to play what's called Risk Revised Edition, because it doesn't take 3 hours. It took us 45 minutes, I think, which I think was a short game, but, at least it was a fulfilling experience. I got really
for
lucky.
you won.
Yeah,
I got really lucky.
It probably wasn't as much of a good time for Shane, because Shane essentially abdicated his role as a responsible party and basically ran away from Brent and gave him the win. But
I was third place for the entire game. It was never even close.
But I think it does point out a potential problem in multiplayer war games, that one person can just run away, and the game's built around the idea that everybody at the game is really competing against each other.
yes.
So I think that's one of the reasons that probably some of the most popular war games are two-player war games, so that the game is built and the design and the mechanic is all about those two people in direct conflict with each other.
So I would probably go a step further than that and say most war games are two-player. So if you think about how military operations work, you've got everything. You start off with men. That's the lowest level of war game, often the lowest level that you think about when you think about military strategy. There is the battlefield kind of tactical game. There is the operational level game where it's bigger than, it's more like a campaign within a war. And then you've got strategic stuff, which covers the whole war. For instance, one of the games that Brent and I have played a few times now is Washington's War, which is the strategic level representation of the American Revolution and covers from the beginning of the war all the way to the end, including, there's variations on when the French come in. All kinds of stuff can happen that were not historical, but are within the bounds of possibility for its time.
And what we've generally found is that the Americans should never have won this war, because strategically they had no advantage to winning this war by the game's rules.
And that's, for me, that's the biggest appeal of war games, is it lets you explore the what ifs, but beyond that, the historical lesson of how likely or unlikely was it that the historical result was the result that was probable?
So I haven't played a lot of war games, and especially two-player war games. Do you find that most of them are based on historical wars, or based in some type of history, or are more of them kind of open-ended?
I would say most of the war games seem to be at least themed around some common conflict. So
Yes.
one of the popular ones that I know Frank and I have played a couple different times is the Command and Colors series. And I think you have 4 different versions of that, Frank, that are
Yes.
set in various time periods from ancients, where you're looking at Greeks and Romans and all of those ancient civilizations, to I think the latest is a
World War
One,
Two.
Two. Okay.
Yeah. Well, the most historically recent one would be World War II.
So what would be the difference between like one of these games and a game that there is conflict, but you wouldn't necessarily consider a war game? So I think of a game like Clash of Cultures, where there could be conflict, but at the same time, I've played games of that where there's literally zero fighting and zero armies on the board the entire time. So for me, there's conflict in that game, but I wouldn't necessarily think of it as a war game because war isn't an integral element to that game.
So I would guess for me, conflict, the only conflict in Clash of Cultures is if a war breaks out.
Mm-hmm.
There's competition otherwise, but not conflict. And I'm not even sure how much competition there is in that game. But go ahead. You were going to say something.
So I think the real difference is some of what's the winning mechanic there. In a war game, it generally the winning mechanic relies upon you destroying at least some element of the force of the other person,
Or conquering territory.
somehow actually involved in that conflict, versus something that's an area control that you might have conflict because 2 people end up in an area together. One of our favorites in this group is Dune, where 2 people end up in the same fortress and aren't allied to each other. There's going to be a battle regardless. And it's really an area control winning mechanism, though, and not a destroy the other person.
Well, yes, but it's conquering specific territories. You have to hold specific territories. Would you consider, Brent, Dune a war game?
I wouldn't. And when you say specific territories, that's only for end of game rules, because it's really, you have to control X amount of the board. And so it's more an area control game for me.
Yeah, I kind of think of Dune more as a war game, maybe because I don't have a lot of experience with war games. But for me, simply because you cannot win the game without direct conflict with other players. There has to be fighting in order for you to win that game. Right? So in Dune, there's a map of the fictional planet of Dune, and there are five stronghold cities,
5
sieges.
strongholds, yes.
And to win the game, you have to take 3.
Yes.
We play house rules in so many variations at times, it's hard to remember the exact rules. But you have to control 3 of these 5 strongholds. For me, it seems like a war game, especially when I think about the books, like, the books are about war. Maybe not traditional, like, US versus England type of war, but it is very much these houses of power fighting against each other for control of the planet.
The final scene is very much a battle.
Yeah.
In the
And
book.
so, I don't know. I think simply because conflict has to be a part of winning that game, I think that's why I view it more as a war game. Whereas again, Clash of Cultures, you can kind of just build up a bunch of buildings and be very cultured and win the game. But in Dune, you have to defeat other people in order to win it.
I think that's probably the way I would define war game versus non-war game. Now, with one exception, and that is if there is for instance, there are several Cold War games. 2 that come to mind are Twilight Struggle and 13 Days, which first one is a large strategic Cold War game. The second one is specifically about the Cuban Missile Crisis. And both of those, there's no fighting per se, but there definitely is political infighting. Some people don't classify that as a war game. I guess I think I do because I think of the Cold War as a war. And that may be as much because I've worked in the defense industry as anything else. But I can see where someone would argue they weren't. But I do like the idea that if you have to fight to win, it's a war game. It's maybe oversimplified, but I like it.
So I think that I would almost want to split this into 2 categories then, and say one's campaign conflict games, and one is battle games. Because a lot of what I traditionally think as of the 2-player war games comes down to, here's a battle scenario. Here's the men you have, the troops you have for this scenario, and then you're playing out that. Even versus Washington's War, which is a campaign and has an element of area control versus win this battle.
Yeah, it does.
But I think those are almost two separate types of games, even because you have to think about it differently. If you're winning one battle, I mean, win a battle, you might not win the war. So if you're winning one battle, you're strategically thinking about what's going on the field at that time, versus winning a campaign that says, I might need to lose these 3 because
it might
I'm
be
going to put them
okay
in.
that I do
Yeah.
because So one of the things that Brent is referring to, and that I did not mention in my description of Washington's War, is Washington's War. You don't win by physically defeating your opponent or by actually conquering some kind of stronghold or victory landmarks. You actually win that one by having political control, and how well you're fighting the war is part of what determines the political alignment of the colonies. I think I still think of that one as a war game because you can't play that game without fighting.
And so I'm willing to concede that that's probably a war game.
Yeah, there's a
But
gray
I
area
think
there.
I think there's 2 different forms of war games there, and that's what I'm trying to get at there.
As opposed to Command and Colors, which is, here's a battle set up, one side fights the other, and there is nothing else. There is no economics, there's no politics, there's nothing. It's just the fight.
And even if you string multiples of those together, because they happen sequentially in history,
it's all about
and
the
you
fight.
save 2 out of 3, you're still fighting the fight.
Yeah.
I think a game that somewhat straddles probably more towards the battle. One of my favorite historical war games that happened a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, Star Wars Rebellion.
Wow. You worked hard to get that in, didn't you?
I was thinking about the whole time you guys were talking. So I played this game once with you, Frank, and
Really?
it was only
once.
Only once. Well, you haven't
And you and I have not had a chance to play
invited
that
me
one.
back to play it, so I've only played it
Wow.
once. And it was just an awesome experience. So Star Wars Rebellion, it's again, Empire versus the Rebels, and
It's episodes 4, 5, and 6 in a box.
yes. And I played the Rebels in that game, and something that I really enjoyed about that game is there were kind of 2 levels of the war taking place. There was kind of the macro war, right? You got all these different pieces that are fighting and ships, and you're losing ships, and you got little men, and you're losing men on different planets. But then also the personal aspect where you actually get to play the individual leaders as well. And for the Rebels, I could send each leader on a different mission to do all these different types of things. So I really enjoyed that. There was both the battle aspect, but also then kind of the political intrigue aspect of sending these leaders on different missions to accomplish these different things across the entire galaxy.
So what amazes me about that game is it does successfully combine very fluidly this larger intergalactic conflict and this heroic level personal endeavor, personal heroics level, and that really does have that feel of the movies. I really think that game, the other one that I love, gets related to it somewhere, is War of the Ring, which is set in Tolkien's Middle Earth. If you've seen the movies, it's at the time of the 3rd edition of the movie, but it's other battles that happen elsewhere, which are not in the novels, not in the movies, except as in the appendix of the books. And that one, you have some of that because you have Frodo and company trying to dunk the ring, and they have some heroics that they can do, not to the level that's in Rebellion. But again, those are ones where the fight is central. In fact, in Star Wars Rebellion, in order for the Empire to win, they actually have to conquer the planet where the rebel base is.
The secret base, yeah.
You can win War of the Ring from either side without a military victory, although I've never seen it happen. No, that's not, well, yeah, I've never seen it happen because I nearly always play the free people and I never win. So, and pretty much they're not going to win a military victory. So,
Yeah, and I think Star Wars Rebellion is a great example, as you said, of tying so many elements together. So in Star Wars Rebellion, you're playing across the entire galaxy, and you're shipping ground troops to different planets. So battles can happen on the ground, they can happen in the air with your ships, and then also what's happening with the individual leaders. When I came over to play it, Frank had it all set up on the table, and there's a lot of pieces, even for a hobby gamer. Like, it's pretty intimidating. But I was very impressed by kind of how seamlessly it all flowed together, and how a lot of the aspects of that game they just kind of made sense. Like, you didn't have to think
Yeah.
of, okay, wait, how can this person move? It just it flowed. Everything
It's intuitive.
kind of very intuitive. That's the word. Everything was very intuitive in that game. So that was one of my favorite aspects of that game, was all the different elements of war that it covered, but at the same time, how accessible it was for, just a hobby gamer to just sit down and play.
So one of the things that's interesting is so far we've really talked about modern war games. Of course, war games go back centuries, where they actually, kind of their roots are in actual military simulations that were run in Europe to try and help figure out, army sizes and all that kind of stuff. And then as time progressed, it kind of split into still military simulations that are still used today for both training and for scenario, for strategic reasons, and then gaming, actual hobby gaming. And for a long time, there were what was referred to as hex and counter games. Some people out there might be familiar with them. Basically, they took a map of the historical battle and overlaid a hexagonal grid, and that was determined movement. And depending on where you were, what hex to hex movement, what terrain you were moving through, that varied how many movement points you got. Each unit had a certain number of movement points, and that's how many each type of terrain would take up a certain number of movement points. And then combat was modified die rolls to determine who won, and mostly it was how many units were lost, whether they had to retreat. If it sounds cumbersome, it's only because it is. As things have moved on, there are still maps that are hex based, but they seem to run a little bit more smoothly. The Command and Color series is one of them. A lot of them have moved on to other types of movement, and we'll probably talk about these in an upcoming season when we talk about various ways of moving around boards and stuff like that. My question to you guys was, have you guys ever played a hex and counter game?
No.
Have you?
I think we did, and I can't remember which game it was. But I do think we sat down and played one early on.
Okay.
The question I wanted to ask, though, and I don't want to get deep into this, but I wanted to ask it up front, is, each of these feature a different kind of conflict mechanism.
Yes.
So what's your favorite conflict mechanism?
Oh, man.
So you mean like, right, in Risk, when there's a battle, you roll dice, compare dice.
Right, you compare dice there.
Yeah.
So you compare dice, higher number wins.
Higher number wins. I really like the mechanism in Dune. If we're going to assume that's a war game, which we are. So in Dune, when you battle, each person has a certain amount of troops or people or whatever you want to call them in the battle. And there's a battle wheel. And with the battle wheel, you select how many troops you want to put into the battle. You can also put a leader, and that leader can have weapons. And one of the things that I really like about Dune is, even if you win the battle, you still lose the amount of troops that you put into that battle. So say you have 10 troops on the board, or in that space, and you commit 8 of them to battle. If you win, you're only going to have 2 in that space. Which in most...
If you lose, you're not going to have any. They're all going to be gone.
Which, I think in most war games I'm at least familiar with the rules. That's pretty unique, that even when you win a battle, you can lose a majority of your troops. Now again, in like Risk, right?
That could happen.
If you can lose a bunch of troops, but each instance of the battle you're losing a small amount. It's not like one round of battle that you're going to lose, 80% of your troops.
So one of the differences is, and when I look at that, I can't help but look at Dune and say what that really is a modified auction game. A battle, right? I'm auctioning how much of my troops, you're auctioning how much of your troops. One of us is going to lose everything. The other one's going to lose at least that many.
Yeah.
So it's kind of an auction. Whereas that's not typically it. Typically, there are some deterministic combat games, and I don't know, I can't think of one off the top of my head. Most of the time, it has to do with that. Most of the time, what you're doing is you're rolling dice, and one of two things happens. Either, like Risk, you compare dice, and highest one wins, and you may do that for a series of dice. The other one is I roll, and that tells me how many hits I get, how many of your dudes I kill, and then you roll, and you see how many dudes of mine you kill. And we either do that till everybody's dead, or in some games we do that for a certain number of rounds.
Maybe it's just my bias against rolling dice.
So think of Star Wars Rebellion, right? That's the way that works. I roll, and based on my roll results, my ships hit so many of your ships.
Right.
And then you're gonna roll.
So that's my favorite mechanic, because it at least allows you to strategize a little bit and go, I know I have double the amount of troops here. Yeah, half of them might miss, but I still have a halfway decent chance of still defeating the other person.
Right. You can run some probabilistic numbers and figure it out.
I don't like the ones that end after a set number of rounds, though. I don't mind the ones that you can retreat, and that
Right.
give you an option to retreat after a number of rounds with probably some penalty, because that's more realistic. But not the ones that just, okay, now here's the end. We ran 3 rounds and we're done.
By the way,
And you have to retreat. If you attacked and you didn't win, you have to retreat, is the way that normally goes.
when Frank says you can run probabilistic numbers, if you're like me, you can't.
So
So just
I-
keep that in mind.
I didn't say I do. I said you can.
Very high level. 2-to-1 versus,
Yeah.
1-to-1. You have an idea you're going to be a little bit better off.
Yeah, if you're like me, I'm like, oh, I got more than he does. Let's attack him. And that's my experience
Nah.
with war games.
So I have had games where I say I've got, particularly something like Risk. I can't think of what it was, but at one point in time I knew if I'm rolling my 3 dice against their 2 dice, the odds are that I will lose 1 and they'll lose 2, or something like that. And I could say, then I could go down and say, okay, that puts me at this, and I'm at this. This puts me, then the next round I'm at this, he's at this. Next round I'm at this, he's at this. And you see a trend within doing that 2 or 3 iterations. You realize he's losing troops faster than I am, or I'm losing troops faster than that determines whether I'm going to attack or not. I don't do that very much anymore because I have more of a feel for it in Risk now. So now I'm more likely to go, yeah, that looks like enough troops. Roll.
The more we do this podcast, the more I realize why I lose so many games.
So, Frank, let's finish this up. What's your favorite conflict resolution mechanism?
So probably the one where we each roll and see how many guys we hit and then go. The only thing I don't like about that is that if you've got a massive battle, now you talk to my son, he will tell you he loves doing a massive battle, but because he likes the epic feel of it. But I look at it and go, we got a 15-minute battle here. I wish this game was moving a little faster. But that probably is still my favorite. Some games actually manage to, because of the way the game is designed, you're never going to have the situation that Shane described early in this podcast where there's this massive, huge army and they're just rolling potentially against another it's just a huge roll off. And that's, you play the revised version of Risk. That's not going to happen. You're never going to have that many troops in one area. In Rebellion, I have seen some decent sized ones, but none that are just, I can't believe we going to spend the next 15 minutes rolling dice. Nothing that size. So I do like that mechanism.
All right, we're gonna bring it down a little bit for all of us more casual gamers here. Is Battleship a war game?
Is Battleship a war game? Yes.
Why do you say yes?
Because it is about the purpose of what I have to do to win the game is sink all your ships. That's directly a military fight kind of a thing. It's not a good war game.
So there's another war game
a
I've
war
played.
game.
I remember, again, growing up, most of my memories
Brent,
are from...
would you agree?
I would say it's not, because there's almost no strategy at all in that game. It's a guess game.
Well, and you certainly could retheme it as not war, right? I mean, it could have been written to be hunting, and you're firing at birds in the air or something. I don't know, but you could retheme that. It could be a strange version of Whack-A-Mole.
They're just tearing apart my childhood dreams here of being a naval officer.
So I am really glad that we have taught you some good games. And you weren't stuck in the misery of your childhood
It's
from the
true.
sounds of it.
Based on what we've heard, it's probably good we're tearing apart your ideas of being a naval officer.
I just like game. I just enjoyed games I could be my dad in, and that was one of them. And yeah, so maybe that's why I could beat him, because there was zero strategy whatsoever, and it was just luck.
There's strategy in that.
I'm starting to think my dad just let me win a lot of games when I was growing up.
I think one of the cool things about a lot of, especially 2-player war games, is that I think at least several of them have rules to be able to play it as a solo as well. And I think more so than I've seen other games, other types of games, where they develop a system that you can use to play yourself against that system.
Yeah, that's really interesting, because certainly that's true for some, but man, that's a mixture. That's actually something that Hex and Counter games, the old style, I think has over modern war games. Some modern war games, I don't care how hard you try, I really think you're going to be hard pressed to find a Command and Colors game that plays well solo. In the Command and Colors games, for those of you who are listening, you're going to play cards that allow you, they're trying to simulate imperfect control of your troops. You play a card that says how many units and where they are on the battlefield that you get to activate that turn. And the idea is that reduces your ability to control your army, simulating that in an actual battle. In a Hex and Counter, that doesn't happen. You can move everything. So it's a perfect information game, which means that for someone who's just interested in the historical what-ifs, they can play both sides as a neutral party and do what makes sense for both sides in a Hex and Counter game, resimulate the battle. To do that effectively in a game with hidden information like cards is a lot harder.
So I know I have one though that was written as a solo. I have Ogre, and I don't know if I've ever played it correctly, because without playing with other people, who knows if you ever actually.
Is that a Hex and Counter game?
It is, and the concept of it is there's a massive prototype tank that's automatic and has gone rogue, and so you're trying to take down this tank that's moving around, and it has very set rules on what it will do every turn. So you can move it in those rule sets and run that system, and you control your guys to try to take that tank out.
So that's the solo version.
It was written as a solo version.
Originally?
Yes. They then wrote multiplayer rules around it, but it was originally a solo game.
Back in the day, because this is a game that's, you've got the reprint, right?
I have the reprint. I have the pocket reprint even. I mean.
Oh, really?
So.
Okay.
It must be a really little tank that fits in your pocket.
Yeah.
It's a chip. So that actually started off as a West End, I think is the name of the company, pocket game, like Starfleet Battle. It literally came in a, 6-inch by 8-inch plastic baggie.
You can't see him, but Frank's holding up his fingers as to how big the game is.
Well, I was trying to get an estimate. So, at any rate, so Ogre goes back to the 80s, probably.
Right.
In its original form.
My in-laws got it for me one Christmas.
That's actually really cool. I've never played that. It's kind of a legendary game.
Like I said, I played it a couple times. I don't know if I did it right.
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter, I guess.
Even when we play games together, half the time we don't play them right the first time.
Well, that's really true. Yeah,
that's true.
Yeah. So here's the thing so war games are probably the biggest subgenre of games that there probably is. I mean, there are people who are gamers that is all they play is war games. They're commonly referred to as grognards within the gaming community. And I don't know where that term comes from, but you will hear people referred to as an old grognard, and that means they probably grew up playing Hex and Counter games and may or may not have moved on to more modern war games. Probably the biggest downfall of war games, as a rule, not in every single case, is they tend to be multi-hour events. There aren't too many that play within 2 hours, and very few that play within an hour. So you're normally sitting down to a 3 to 6 hour event, depending on the game. Sometimes within the same game, Dune, for instance, we've had that one run anywhere from an hour and a half to close to 5 hours, I think.
Well, one time it was like 45 minutes because you and your son blew each other off the board. So, I mean, that's another way to make them shorter is you just blow another player off the board, and
Well, we
then
blew.
the other people can win.
We blew each other off the board.
Yes,
So a third of the game was out.
mutual
We
destruction.
had lost within one turn.
It's true. It's true. Another quick way to end a game, which I did playing Risk a lot growing up, is you just flip the board.
Is to abdicate.
Well,
your
abdicate
actual...
in anger. You just
Oh
flip
no, I
the
thought
board.
you just meant.
But then the
bow
bad
off.
thing about that is you spend the next hour picking up all those stupid little pieces out of the shag carpet in your parents' basement. So that's never fun.
So that's where the experiences come in. Now you just don't, you refuse to engage, so one person wins easily.
Or you just make sure nobody has the same colored pieces as the color of the carpet. That's another.
Oh, there you go.
That's a much easier way to handle that as well.
Yeah, that was my sister's way of handling eating pizza in the living room when we got new carpet. She made sure that the new carpet was pizza colored so that Mom and Dad wouldn't actually say no.
That makes a lot of sense. A lot of sense. So, if we want to suggest a war game to our listeners to go and try out, what game are we going to suggest today?
You got one, Brent? Because I have one.
I would suggest the Command and Color series, and depending on where your flavor lies in historical relevancy, choose your favorite. But I think they all pretty much play about the same.
So I would be. So there are some complexity differences. I would by and large agree with you, but I would specifically say Battle Cry within that series. Battle Cry is the Civil War version of the game. It's the first one. It's a little bit lighter on rules than the other ones. And then if that one works for you in terms of comprehension, even if it's not the militarily historical period that you would pick, then go to the other ones. And there are now, I don't know, I just pre-ordered Command and Colors Medieval, but there are probably about 8 versions of that game spanning, as Brent said, there's even one that's arguably not Command and Colors, but is a science fiction version of the game. And apparently the guy's got stuff for naval battles on, that he's thought about and has pretty much ready to go. The designer is a guy named Richard Ward, and he's done a whole series of these games, and they translate very well to each era with some tweaking of the rules.
Yeah, and I would say go to your local thrift store. They're going to have Risk. If they don't, somebody around you has Risk. And I'd say play that. However, play with the mission cards. So instead of just defeating the globe, you have to accomplish certain missions. And then Google nuclear Risk. So it integrates nuclear threats into the game, which is really fun.
So these mission cards, are these part of regular Risk now?
Every version of Risk I've ever had has mission cards.
That's interesting, because prior to revised Risk, I had never seen a version of Risk that had mission cards.
Yeah, I remember the very earliest version we had growing up had mission cards. So
that's interesting. Huh. The other possibility is there are a few other versions of Risk that are much more highly rated than your standard version of Risk. Going to be a little bit harder to find, but you should be able to find them on Amazon. 2 that immediately come to mind are Risk, I believe it's 2210, which is futuristic and includes conquering the moon as one of its things. Or Risk Godstorm, which is set in a kind of a mythical Earth. I think there's Greek and Roman and Norse gods and the like. But I've never played it, so don't take my word on that. But those both, that flavor shortens the game because it gives some objectives or missions, and does some other things. So that's another possibility. If you've got some familiarity with Risk, the core mechanisms don't change, but Risk modified from the basic 5-hour let's eliminate everybody slowly one at a time version, I think is a good start too.
Yeah, I think I've also enjoyed Clone Wars Risk. So if you like Star Wars and if you like killing off a ton of Jedi, that's a fun version.
So, any last words before we? Not that sounds ominous, but
any last words?
So I think war games are awesome only because they span any historical theme, whatever. Conflict is such a huge part of human nature almost that these can be set anywhere and can appeal to anyone in some way or another. So it's a great category. Go try some out yourself and let us know what you enjoy.
Or call us and we'll come play one with you.
There we go. Have a good day. Thanks for listening. Share this with your friends. Try and get one person more to listen to our podcast. This is Frank with a quick programming note before we go. First of all, we'd like to thank you for listening to the podcast. Hopefully you have had as much fun listening to us as we have had producing it. Secondly, I wanted to remind everyone that we are approaching the end of our first season. In fact, the last episode will drop the Wednesday before Thanksgiving. After that, we will take the month of December off and then come back to you at the beginning of the new year. Thanks again. This has been the Analog Gamers Podcast. You can find us at theanaloggamers.libsyn.com. You can email us at theanaloggamers@gmail.com or find us on Facebook as The Analog Gamers. The Analog Gamers Podcast is licensed under Attribution, No Commercial, Non-Derivative, Creative Commons 3.0 license.